So we added this favorite meals notifier and therefore in the end the favorite meals provider. And with that, we see a more complex example for a provider that does not just provide static data, which doesn't change as we're doing it with the meals provider, but instead for a provider that does in the end provide an object that does allow us to change data. And that typically is the more common use case. And it's the same approach I now want to use for adding a filters provider. Though for this provider, for the filters provider, which we're about to add in the next lectures, you will see that we'll actually take it a step further and build a provider that depends on another provider, as you will see. So let's get started with that. And for that, I'll add a new file in the providers folder, the filters provider .dart file. And in that file, the goal, of course, is to add such a filters provider. So therefore, we must import Flutter Riverpod again, as we did it before in the other provider files. And now in this file here, I in the end want to create a filters provider and store it in a variable or a final variable here. And I will do this again with the state notifier provider, just as we did it for the favorites provider. There we also used state notifier provider. Now I'll use the same provider here for implementing the filters provider. Therefore, we also must add a class again, as we did it for the favorites provider. So here I'll add my filters notifier, which extends state notifier. And state notifier, as before, is a generic class, which in the end will manage a map of filters. And for that, this map, of course, should have filter keys and then Boolean values. Now, for the filter keys I did before provide them here in filter start, now I'll actually move this enum here from filter start to the filters provider file so that all the meta management of filters and all the type definitions for my filters basically happen here. So with that, I have my enum here. I have my filter here, therefore, in this map definition. And of course, to use this filter type in other files, we'll then have to make sure that we import this filters provider Dart file into these other files, but that is something I'll do later. So with that here, I have this filters notifier. And then as before for the favorites notifier, we must set an initial state by adding the constructor function and then the initializer list where we call super and where we then pass our initial state to the parent class. Now for the favorites provider, the initial state was an empty list. For the filters provider, it should be a map of filters where every filter is set to false initially. So here we basically have filter gluten-free set to false, filter lactose-free set to false, and the same for vegetarian, and then of course also for the vegan filter. So that's now my initial filter state here. And with that state defined, we can then add a method that allows us to manipulate that state in an immutable way, as you learned. So therefore here I'll add a method which I'll call setFilter, where I expect to get the filter that should be set as an input. So a value of type filter to identify which filter should be set to a different value. And then I get a Boolean value, is active, could be a fitting name, which defines whether this filter is now set to true or false. And with that data received, we can now update the state. Now again, as mentioned before, we must do this in an immutable way. So accessing state filter like this and setting it to the updated value would not be allowed, because here we are mutating the state in memory, and that's not allowed. Therefore, what you should do instead is you should set the state to a new map, and that should in the end be your old map with the updated key. And one way of creating such a new map here is to copy the existing map and its existing key value pairs with the spread operator, just as we did it for the list. This also works for maps inside of maps. So this copies the existing map's key value pairs into this new map. And then we can explicitly set one key, like here this filter, to a new value, is active. So that will then overwrite the key value pair with the same filter identifier that has been copied, and all the other key value pairs will be kept along with this new setting here. And with that, we are creating a new map with the old key value pairs and one new key value pair that overwrites the respective old key value pair for the same filter. And that's essentially all the logic we have to add here to update our filters, or to be precise, to update one of our filters in this map. Now with that, we got this filters notifier, and therefore now in this filters provider, we want to return an instance of our filters notifier, like this. Same logic as before with the favorites notifier. And as before, we should add these generic type annotations here to state notifier provider to get better typing support in the places where we use this provider. Here we should make it clear that this will refer to the filters notifier, which then in the end will resolve to a map where we have filters and Boolean values. With that, we got the basic version of the filters notifier, and we can now use that version in our code. Now in the tab start file, I, for example, must import filters provider to get access to this enum, since I now moved this enum from the filters screen file to the filters provider file. I can also remove the meal model import here, by the way, in the tab start file, because we're not using anything from that file anymore. But on the other hand, as mentioned, I should add my import to providers filter provider to make sure that the filter enum is available in this file. More importantly though, we have to go to filters Dart, and in there we should also add an import to this filter provider. So to providers and then filters provider. But we must also add an import to RiverPod. So to Flutter RiverPod, like this. Because with this import added here, we can now connect the filters screen widget to our provider and get access to that provider. We do that, as you learned, by replacing the stateful widget with the consumer stateful widget provided by Flutter RiverPod. And state with consumer state, also here when we define this type. And with that done, we can use this ref keyword here in filters screen state to set our filters.